The 3 words that changed my life weren't, "I love you," they were, "You're not family." My father said them to me, his voice as cold as the marble floor of the lawyer's office. We were standing in. My mother and my sister just stood there, watching, their silence his ultimate weapon. Have you ever been made to feel like a complete stranger by the very people who are supposed to know you best? That day, they didn't just kick me out, they tried to erase me. This is the story of how I stopped being their forgotten daughter and became their landlord. And then their worst nightmare. The air in the lawyer's office was thick with the scent of old leather and entitlement. It was a sterile, unwelcoming room, all dark mahogany and muted gold accents, designed to make you feel small. It was working. I sat on a plush chair that felt like it was trying to swallow me whole, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Across the vast, polished desk, my father, Harrison Croft, tapped an impatient rhythm on his briefcase. He looked perfectly at home, a king in his element. Beside him, my sister, Brooke, was a mirror image of his ambition, her phone screen glowing as she discreetly checked stock prices. My mother, Beatrice, sat a little apart from them, a statue of quiet approval, her posture immaculate, her expression unreadable. And then there was my Uncle Paul, my mother's brother, squeezed into a corner chair, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He kept adjusting his tie, his gaze fixed on a point on the Persian rug. He was a good man, a gentle man, caught in the gravitational pull of my father's wealth. We were there for the reading of the will of my grandmother, Josephine Croft. For my father and sister, it was a business transaction, the final tallying of an account. For me, it felt like a second funeral. Grandma Josephine was the only one who didn't look at my sketchbook with thinly veiled disappointment. She was the one who bought me my first set of real oil paints, who told me that building worlds on canvas was just as important as building them with concrete and steel. The lawyer, a man with a tired face and a crisp suit, cleared his throat and began to read in a dry monotone. Stocks, bonds, a portfolio of securities all neatly divided, the bulk of it going to my father to be absorbed into Croft Construction. Brooke got a significant trust fund, and my mother the jewelry. I was left a modest sum, enough for a down payment on a small apartment. The lawyer noted. My father grunted, a sound of mild annoyance, as if even that small amount granted to me was an inconvenience. Then, the lawyer paused. "And now," he said, adjusting his glasses, "regarding the primary residence at 1420 Willow Creek Lane." A hush fell over the room. That house wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was my grandmother's heart. A sprawling, historic home with a garden she'd tended for 50 years. It was where I'd spent my happiest moments, sketching in the sunroom while she hummed. "The property," the lawyer continued, "is to be held in the Josephine Croft Trust for the benefit of the family. Day-to-day stewardship and management of the property shall fall to Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Croft." My father's chest puffed out. He shot a triumphant glance at my mother. He had won. He would control it. But something in the wording felt specific. Grandma was a meticulous woman. My voice was small, barely a squeak. "Excuse me," I said. The lawyer looked up, surprised I'd spoken. My father's head snapped towards me. "Just a question. What are the specific bylaws of the trust? Who is the ultimate beneficiary?" It was a simple question, a reasonable question. But in my family, questions were challenges. My father's face, which had been smug and satisfied, began to darken. The veins in his neck stood out. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Brooke lowered her phone, a smirk playing on her lips. She knew what was coming. "I just want to understand Grandma's wishes," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "A trust has rules, and—" "Don't you question my intelligence, Ava," he snarled, leaning forward. The mahogany desk felt like a wall between us. "Do you think I don't know how to tend a property? Is that what your useless art degree taught you? How to question your betters?" The word hung in the air. Useless. It was his favorite word for me. That's not what I meant, I stammered. I just, you know what your problem is? He stood up, his large frame casting a shadow over the desk. You contribute nothing. You sit around with your little drawings, waiting for a handout. You're a failure, Ava. A leech on this family's name. Each word was a physical blow. I looked to my mother, my silent plea begging her to intervene. She stared back, her expression a cold, blank wall. There was no help there. There never was. Her loyalty was to him, to the lifestyle he provided. Uncle Paul sank deeper into his chair, his face pale, his eyes now glued to his own shoes. He was a prisoner here too. I loved her, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. I just want to make sure her legacy is protected. That was the final straw. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at me, his face contorted with rage. Legacy? You are not part of this legacy. You want to be so different? Mean. You're not family anymore. Get out of my sight. You are banned from that house and from this family. Do you understand me? You are nobody. The silence that followed was absolute. The lawyer stared, frozen. Brooke looked pleased. My mother simply smoothed a wrinkle in her skirt. He had said it. He had unmade me with a few words. I stood up, my legs shaking. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of the office, the lawyer's pitying gaze burning a hole in my back. I didn't look at Uncle Paul, but I felt his shame radiating from the corner of the room. That night, I drove to the house I grew up in, the one my parents lived in. I just wanted to get my things, my clothes, my sketchbooks. But I was too late. On the curb, under the cold, indifferent glow of a streetlight, were 3 black trash bags, my life, my memories, my art, all bundled up and discarded like garbage. That's when I knew. It wasn't just an argument. It was an excommunication. The first week was a blur of shame and logistics. My car, a beat-up 10-year-old sedan, became my home. I'd park in the 24-hour supermarket lot, trying to recline the driver's seat, just enough to stop the seatbelt buckle from digging into my back. Every time headlights swept across my windshield, my heart would leap into my throat, convinced it was the police, or worse, someone I knew. The humiliation was a physical thing, a constant heavy coat I couldn't take off. It was cold at night, a damp chill that seeped through the car doors and settled deep in my bones. I'd wake up stiff and sore, the faint smell of old upholstery and my own fear clinging to me. I learned to wash my face and brush my teeth in gas station bathrooms, avoiding my own reflection in the grimy mirrors. Looking at myself meant acknowledging the hollowed-out look in my eyes, the dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights. After a few days of this, I called the only friend I had left in the city, a girl I knew from a college art class. She let me crash on her lumpy couch, no questions asked, for which I was eternally grateful. But I could feel my presence wearing on her. Her studio apartment was tiny, and my cloud of misery was taking up more space than my body. I knew I couldn't stay long. The money from my grandmother was a lifeline, but I knew it wouldn't last forever. I needed a job, any job. The most painful thing I did in those first few weeks was sell my art supplies. I took my French easel, my collection of oil paints, tubes of cadmium yellow and cerulean blue that Grandma Josephine had bought me, and my pristine canvases, to a pawn shop. The man behind the counter offered me a fraction of what they were worth. I took it without haggling. Handing over those brushes felt like handing over a piece of my soul. It was the final admission of defeat, the final proof that my father had been right all along. I was useless. My passions were worthless. My job search was a series of rejections. I was overqualified for retail, underqualified for anything corporate. Finally, I saw an ad for a receptionist at a place called Grimes Real Estate. The office was in an old, forgotten part of town, a 2-story brick building, squeezed between a laundromat and a check-cashing place. The inside was just as dreary. The air was thick with the smell of dust and stale coffee. Piles of files overflowed from gray metal cabinets. It was the opposite of the sleek mahogany world my father inhabited. It was perfect. The work was mind-numbing. Grimes Real Estate. How can I help you? I'd say, 100 times a day. I made coffee. I sorted mail. I filed endless stacks of paper into those groaning cabinets. Every time I filed a document, a deed, a lease agreement, a title report, my father's voice would echo in my head. Loser, failure, nobody. I was at the absolute bottom. But a strange thing happens when you hit rock bottom. You have nowhere to look but up. And you start to notice things. In my grief and boredom, something inside me began to harden. I stopped just mindlessly filing. I started reading. I started listening. I listened to the terse phone calls the agents made, picking up bits of jargon, escrow, contingency, assessed value. I started paying attention to the documents I was handling. I noticed the patterns in zoning applications, the way property lines were drawn on plats, the dense legal language of contracts. I was no longer Ava the failed artist. I was a ghost in the machine, an invisible observer learning the secret language of the world my father dominated. I wasn't just filing paper anymore. I was gathering intelligence. I was studying, and for the first time since I saw those trash bags on the curb, a tiny, cold glimmer of something that wasn't despair began to flicker inside me. It felt like purpose. The owner of the firm was a man named Arthur Grimes. He was a ghost in his own office. A man in his late 60s who seemed to be composed entirely of grumbles and shadows. He had a face like a crumpled road map, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. He was tall and stooped, and he wore the same rotation of 3 tired-looking cardigans. He barely acknowledged my existence beyond a curt nod in the morning. To him, I was just part of the office furniture, the person who made sure the coffee pot was never empty. I was fine with that. It made me invisible, and invisibility was my shield. For weeks my life settled into a dull routine. Wake up on the lumpy couch, take the bus to the dusty office, answer phones, file papers, go home, sleep. But I wasn't just going through the motions. Every document I touched, I studied. I was building a mental map of the city, not of its streets and landmarks, but of its ownership. I knew who owned the corner lots, which commercial strips were underperforming, and where the city was quietly buying up land. I didn't know why I was doing it, but it felt like I was forging a key, even if I hadn't found a lock yet. One Tuesday afternoon, the lock appeared. Arthur was on the phone in his office, and he wasn't a ghost anymore. His voice was a low growl, rumbling through the thin wall. "What do you mean the zoning changed? We had a verbal agreement. That's a $500,000 deal down the drain, because someone at City Hall decided to reclassify a C2 to an R1 overnight." He slammed the phone down with a force that rattled my coffee cup. He had lost a big deal on a small commercial property, a deal that would have kept the lights on for another 6 months. That evening, long after the other agents had left, I stayed behind. I told my friend I was working late. I walked into the file room and pulled the cabinet drawer, labeled Municipal Zoning. I found the file for the property Arthur had lost. Then I went to the city's public records website, a clunky, outdated portal that was a nightmare to navigate. I spent hours, my eyes burning from the screen's glare, cross-referencing city council meeting minutes with old property maps I found in the county's digital archives. Around 2 a.m. I found it. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was a pattern. Over the last 18 months, the city had spot rezoned 4 different territories, seemingly at random, but when I mapped them out, they weren't random at all. They formed a perfect contiguous line, creating a huge parcel of land that was now zoned exclusively for high-density residential development. And every one of those spot rezonings had directly benefited one company, a massive developer from out of state. Arthur hadn't been unlucky, he'd been strategically cut out. My heart was pounding. I opened a blank document and started typing. I wrote a simple 2-page report. No emotion, just facts. I detailed the pattern, included dates and links to the public records, and using the trajectory, I predicted the next 3 small commercially zoned areas that were likely to be targeted for rezoning within the next year. My hands were shaking as I printed it out. I crept into Arthur's office, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, and placed the 2 sheets of paper squarely in the middle of his desk. I felt a surge of terror. What was I doing? He could fire me for this. He could laugh at me. It was the first time I had put myself out there since the day in the lawyer's office, and I was terrified. The next morning, I could barely drink my coffee. My stomach was in such a knot. Arthur came in at his usual time, gave his usual curt nod, and disappeared into his office, closing the door behind him. The silence was deafening. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, at 11 a.m., the intercom on my desk crackled to life. "Ava," Arthur's voice said. "My office. Now." I walked in, my legs feeling like lead. He was sitting at his desk, my report in his hand. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the paper. He didn't praise me. He didn't yell. He just asked one question, his voice quiet and intense. "How did you find this?" I explained my process, my voice barely a whisper at first, then gaining strength as I laid out the facts. I told him about the public records portal, the archived maps, the pattern that emerged. I spoke for 5 minutes straight. When I was done, he was silent for a long, long time, just looking at me. The intimidating, gruff man was gone. In his place was someone I hadn't seen before, someone with a deep, old sadness in his eyes. Finally, he spoke. 30 years ago, he said, his voice raspy, I was the Harrison Croft of this town. Grimes Construction. We built half the downtown core. I had it all. And I lost it. I lost every penny. He paused. Looking out the window, my own brother, my partner, used our company's credit to make a secret leveraged deal on a piece of land he thought was a sure thing. He was a gunslinger, always looking for the big score. He never read the fine print. The deal went bad, and it took the whole company down with it. He bankrupted us because he was arrogant, and he didn't do the homework. He turned his gaze back to me, and it was sharp, analytical. I was a gunslinger, Arthur said, tapping my report with his finger. You're a sniper. You see the details I stopped looking for. He leaned back in his chair, a flicker of something new in his expression. You see the tripwires. Arthur Grimes became my mentor, but not in the way you see in movies. There were no inspiring speeches or pats on the back. His mentorship was a transaction, forged in his own past failures. I'll teach you this business, Ava, he told me one afternoon, his voice as dry as the dust on the files. I'll show you how it really works. Not the nonsense they teach you in some class. But you owe me. I'm making an investment in you, and I expect a return. His motive was crystal clear. He wasn't just helping me. He was trying to prove that his own downfall wasn't the only way. He wanted to see his principles of meticulous, careful, honorable business win out against the reckless arrogance that had ruined him. My success would be his vicarious victory. The first thing he did was pay for my real estate license courses. It was an online program, and my life became a grueling cycle of work and study. I'd spend 8 hours at the office answering phones and filing, then come home to the lumpy couch and spend another 6 hours staring at a computer screen, my brain swimming in a sea of legal jargon. I learned about riparian rights, fee simple estates, and the staggering complexity of contract law. I made hundreds of flashcards, memorizing terms until they were burned into my memory. My friend would come home from her waitressing job and find me asleep on the couch, a textbook open on my chest, a highlighter still in my hand. The exhaustion was bone deep. There were nights I was so tired I'd cry from sheer frustration, convinced I couldn't absorb another piece of information. The words on the screen would blur together, and my father's voice would creep back in, whispering, "You're not smart enough for this. This is a world for real players, not for failures like you." But then I'd think of Arthur's story, of the quiet intensity in his eyes when he called me a sniper. I was fighting for him as much as for myself. The day of the state exam was terrifying. I sat in a cold, impersonal testing center, the air buzzing with the low hum of computers and the nervous energy of the other hopefuls. I felt like a complete imposter. But as I started the test, something shifted. The questions weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were real. I could see the documents from the office in my mind's eye. I could hear the agents on the phone. I knew this world now. I had lived it from the inside out. 2 weeks later, an official-looking envelope arrived. I tore it open with trembling hands. I had passed, on the first try. I went into the office, the letter clutched in my hand, and walked up to Arthur's desk. I didn't say anything. I just laid it down in front of him. He picked it up, read it, and put it back down. He looked at me, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of a smile, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He just gave me a single, curt nod. From Arthur Grimes. That was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The next day, my duties changed. The phone stopped being my primary responsibility. Arthur started giving me small but important tasks. "Ava, run a title search on this address," he'd grumble, tossing a file onto my desk. "Get me a market valuation for the properties on this block." I was no longer just filing the results. I was producing them. I built my first spreadsheet to track market trends in a developing neighborhood, color-coding properties based on their investment potential. I learned how to read a mortgage agreement, how to spot the hidden clauses and balloon payments. I learned the difference between a lien and a deed of trust. The work was procedural. It was difficult, and it required a level of attention to detail that my old life of sketching and painting had surprisingly prepared me for. For the first time, I felt truly competent. I was forging tools, building an arsenal of knowledge that no one, not even my father, could take away from me. One morning, Arthur called me into his office. He had a look on his face I hadn't seen before, a mix of appraisal and challenge. "You're ready?" he said, not as a question but as a statement. "I want you to find a property, something undervalued, something we can flip quickly, your first real assignment." It felt like the final exam. He was handing me a loaded gun and telling me to go hunt. I spent the next 2 weeks combing through foreclosure lists, tax auction notices, and off-market whispers I'd picked up from listening in the office. I lived and breathed it, my mind a whirlwind of addresses and numbers, and then I found it. It was perfect, almost too perfect, a small, single-family home in a decent, up-and-coming neighborhood. The house itself was a little rundown, but the numbers didn't make sense. The property was scheduled for a tax auction in 3 weeks due to a massive, unrecorded lien for unpaid property taxes, stretching back 5 years. The amount was so high, no one else was touching it. The owners, an elderly couple, were about to lose their home of 40 years for pennies on the dollar. A cold thrill ran through me. This was it. This was the kind of deal that made fortunes. I could legally acquire the house for the cost of the back taxes, which, while substantial, was a fraction of its market value. I could see the path laid out before me: buy it, make a few cosmetic repairs, and sell it for a 6-figure profit. A voice in my head, a voice that sounded disturbingly like my father's, was cheering me on. "This is how the game is played, Ava. The strong take what the weak can't hold on to." Harrison Croft would have celebrated this move. He would have called it smart, aggressive, a killer instinct. I spent a whole day preparing the bid paperwork, but as I filled out the forms, a wave of nausea rolled over me. I thought of the elderly couple, blissfully unaware that their world was about to be ripped out from under them. I thought of my grandmother Josephine, who believed that a home was a sanctuary, not a commodity. I looked at the paperwork, at the cold, predatory numbers, and I saw a reflection of my father. I saw the person I was terrified of becoming. That night, I couldn't sleep. I threw the bid paperwork in the trash. The next morning, I went back to the county records. But this time, I wasn't looking for an opportunity. I was looking for an error. I spent a week on the phone, navigating the bureaucratic maze of the county tax assessor's office. I was transferred, put on hold, and hung up on. But I was relentless. I was a sniper, as Arthur had said. I was looking for the one detail everyone else had missed. And I found it. The lien was a clerical error. A typo. Someone had added an extra zero to the original assessment, and the mistake had been compounded year after year. The couple didn't owe $50,000. They owed $5,000. They had been paying the incorrect inflated bill for years, draining their savings, thinking it was just the cost of living. I printed out all my documentation. I didn't go to the auction. I went to the couple's house. I knocked on their door, my heart pounding. A kind-faced woman with white hair answered. I spent an hour at their kitchen table, with her and her husband, explaining the situation in simple, clear terms. I showed them the paperwork where the error had been made, and I walked them through the forms they needed to file to get it corrected and receive a refund for their overpayments. They cried, they hugged me, they offered me money, which I refused. I went back to the office that afternoon with an empty file and zero profit. I walked into Arthur's office and told him everything. I told him about the perfect deal, the predatory opportunity, and what I had done instead. When I finished, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. I held my breath, convinced I was about to be fired for wasting my time and his resources. I had failed my first assignment. He was silent for a full minute. Then he leaned forward, and the look in his eyes was one of deep, profound respect. "Good," he said, his voice quiet. "You can't build an empire on rotten foundations. Any fool can make a buck by kicking someone who's already down. It takes character to build something that lasts." At that moment, I knew he didn't just trust my intellect anymore. He trusted me. The small profit from the condo flip felt like $1 million. It was mine. I had earned it through sleepless nights, paint-splattered clothes, and sheer determination. I used a portion of it to finally get my own place, a tiny sun-filled studio apartment with a view of a brick wall. It was heaven. It was a space that my family had never seen, had never judged. It was a place where I could breathe. I was starting to build a life, a small one, but one that was entirely my own. Of course, in a town this size, news travels. I'm not sure how they heard, maybe through some real estate gossip circles my father was a part of. But they did. One evening, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was before I even answered. "Hello?" I said, my voice cautious. "Well, well, well." A familiar syrupy voice dripped through the speaker. It was my sister, Brooke. "I heard you're playing real estate agent now. How cute. Did you sell a little house to some little people?" Her condescension was a physical thing, a slime that I could feel coating the phone. "I'm doing okay, Brooke," I said, keeping my voice even. "Are you?" She laughed. A short, sharp, ugly sound. "Because Dad and I were just talking. We think it's just a hobby. You know, something to keep you busy before you finally realize you're a nobody and come crawling back for a real job. But don't worry, the offer to be my personal assistant is still on the table. You're good at getting coffee." I hung up. My hands were shaking. Her words had found the old wounds and pressed on them hard. Hobby, cute, nobody. It was a coordinated attack. A reminder that they were watching and that they would never see me as anything but a failure. I tried to shake it off. I had a plan. I was going to take my $30,000 profit, combine it with a small business loan, and buy a duplex. It was the next logical step, a bigger project that could generate real income. I spent weeks finding the perfect property, running the numbers, and preparing a loan application that was flawless. I had a pre-approval from a local bank, and my loan officer, a friendly man named Mark, had been enthusiastic. Then, 2 weeks after Brooke's call, everything went cold. Mark stopped returning my calls. When I finally got him on the phone, he was stammering, his voice tight with discomfort. Ava, I'm sorry, he said. There's been a complication with your file. A complication? What kind of complication? My credit is good. The property appraised perfectly, I said, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him shuffling papers. Look, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I shouldn't be telling you this. But a call was made from a very influential person, a major player in the local construction market. He didn't have to say the name. Harrison Croft. He flagged you as a high-risk borrower, Mark continued, a note of apology in his voice. He said, you were unreliable, had no real business experience. He basically scared the underwriters off. Ava, my hands are tied. The committee denied the loan. I felt the air leave my lungs. It was one thing to be mocked and insulted. It was another thing entirely to be actively, maliciously sabotaged. He hadn't just insulted me. He had reached out with his immense power and crushed my first real attempt to climb the ladder. I was devastated. It was a clear, brutal message. We can destroy you whenever we want. You will never escape us. The small world I had started to build felt like it was about to be washed away by the tide of my father's influence. I sat in my sunny little apartment, and for the first time in months, it felt like a cage. I sat in my apartment for a full day, the rejection letter from the bank on my table like a tombstone. The silence was deafening, filled only by the triumphant echoes of my father's power and Brooke's mocking laughter. I felt that old, familiar despair creeping back in, the feeling of being small and helpless. But this time, something was different. Underneath the devastation, there was a spark of cold, hard anger. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about survival. The next morning, I walked into Arthur's office and put the letter on his desk. I told him the whole story, my voice flat and devoid of the emotion that was churning inside me. He read the letter, his expression grim. He wasn't surprised. He leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning in protest, and looked at me with an intensity that burned. So, he's playing dirty, Arthur said. It wasn't a question. He's using his weight to shut you out of the system. You'll never get a conventional loan in this town as long as he's making calls. He paused, tapping a finger on his desk. So, you have to stop playing his game. Don't fight them on their battlefield, Ava. Buy the battlefield. I didn't understand. What does that mean? It means you stop asking for permission from his world, Arthur said. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. There are other worlds, other sources of money. A week later, I was standing in a sleek, minimalist boardroom that was a world away from Arthur's dusty office. Arthur had introduced me to a private investment group he occasionally advised. They weren't gunslingers like my father. They were quiet, patient individuals, doctors, tech entrepreneurs, old money inheritors, who valued integrity and stable, long-term returns over flashy high-risk ventures. I was terrified. I was a 24-year-old girl in a borrowed blazer, about to ask for a significant line of credit. But Arthur had coached me. Don't sell them a property, he'd said. Sell them you. So, I stood before them, my heart hammering against my ribs. And I didn't start with numbers. I started with a story. I told them about the elderly couple and the clerical error on their tax bill. I told them about walking away from a six-figure profit because it wasn't the right thing to do. I laid out my meticulous research, my business plan, and my vision for building a portfolio based on value and ethics, not predation. When I was finished, the room was silent. Then, a woman at the head of the table, the one who had been watching me the most intently, spoke. Mr. Grimes told us I were a sniper, she said. He was right. They didn't give me a loan. They gave me something far more powerful, a significant secured line of credit. It was a war chest. The first thing I did was form my own company. I went online and filed the paperwork. Sesti Properties, LL. Seeing my initials on that official document felt like forging a new identity. Ava Davenport, the artist, was gone. SD Properties was here now. My first move as a CEO wasn't to buy a flip. It was to hire a private investigator and a forensic accountant. It felt cloak and dagger, but it was a necessary business expense. My instructions were simple: get every single document related to the Josephine Croft Trust and the property at 1420 Willow Creek Lane. A month later, the report landed on my desk. The discovery was stunning. It was better than I could have ever imagined. My father, in his monumental arrogance, had never bothered with the fine print of my grandmother's will. He had heard the words stewardship and management and assumed it meant ownership. He was wrong. The trust documents were ironclad. He and my mother were designated as stewards, caretakers, not owners. They were legally obligated to maintain the property and pay its expenses. And then came the bombshell. The trust stipulated that upon Grandma Josephine's death, the house was to be managed by them until the sole named beneficiary came of age and demonstrated financial independence. My grandmother, the quiet, gentle woman who loved my drawings, had played the long game. The sole named beneficiary, her only other namesake, was me, Ava Josephine Davenport. Because my father had never legally transferred the deed out of the trust, a complex process he'd likely deemed a waste of time and lawyers' fees, he and my mother were in effect glorified tenants. They had been living there for years, paying the mortgage on an asset that was legally beneficially mine. A cold, brilliant plan formed in my mind. It was clean. It was legal. It was devastating. Using the line of credit for my new investors, my LLC made a call to the bank that held the mortgage on the house. I didn't ask to assume the mortgage. I offered to buy the note outright. For a bank, a mortgage is an asset, but it's also a long-term liability. The chance to get the full remaining balance paid off in one lump sum was an attractive offer. After a brief negotiation, they agreed. In one clean, quiet digital transaction, Sesti Properties LLC purchased the debt. I became the lien holder. I owned the mortgage. If they missed a single payment, I could foreclose. But it was even better than that. As the primary beneficiary of the trust that owned the property, and the owner of the debt secured by it, I effectively held all the cards. I owned the house, and they had absolutely no idea. It was a week before Christmas. The city was covered in a thin blanket of snow, and festive lights twinkled in every window. It was a season that was supposed to be about family and togetherness, which for me only highlighted my isolation. Then my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my mother. I hadn't heard a word from her since the day in the lawyer's office. The message read, "We're having the family Christmas dinner on the 23rd. We expect you to be there to apologize for your behavior." I read it twice, then a third time. The audacity was breathtaking. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance. This wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. This wasn't an olive branch, it was a command. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted me to come crawling back, tail between my legs, to beg for forgiveness in front of the whole family. They wanted to see me, the failed artist, the pathetic nobody, admit that my little attempt at independence had failed, and that I couldn't survive without them. They wanted to reassert their power, to put me back in my place once and for all. For a moment, a tremor of my old fear ran through me. The muscle memory of being the family scapegoat is a powerful thing. The thought of walking back into that house, into that atmosphere of judgment and contempt, made my stomach clench. Part of me, the small broken part, just wanted to curl up and disappear. I picked up the phone and dialed Arthur. "They've invited me to Christmas dinner," I said, my voice tight. "They said they expect me to apologize." I heard a low chuckle on the other end of the line. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was the sound of a seasoned general hearing a predictable enemy tactic. "Ava," he said, and his voice was as steady and solid as a rock. Listen to me very carefully. They think they're inviting you to their house. They're not. They are tenants in your asset. Remember that. You don't go there to apologize. You go there to give notice. His words sliced through my fear like a hot knife through butter. He was right. Everything shifted. The fear didn't just recede. It was replaced by something cold, clear, and hard as diamond. My resolve, which had been wavering, now hardened into steel. They had summoned Ava Davenport, the timid artist they had kicked to the curb. But the person who would be walking through that door was SD Properties LLC. I wasn't going to a family dinner. I was going to a business meeting. A close. I arrived at precisely 7 p.m. on the 23rd. I parked my old sedan down the street, out of sight. As I walked up the stone pathway, I took a moment to look at the house. It was just as beautiful as I remembered. But the decorations were pure, Harrison Croft. Garish. Oversized lights dripped from every eave, and two enormous inflatable snowmen flanked the front door, their blank smiles looking idiotic in the crisp winter air. It was a display of wealth, not of warmth. I rang the doorbell. After a long moment, the door was opened by my mother. She looked me up and down, her expression a mixture of disapproval and triumph. "Ava," she said, her voice cool. "You're late." "I'm right on time," I replied, stepping past her into the entryway. The house was warm, filled with the scent of roasted turkey and pine. In the formal living room, my father sat in his favorite wingback chair like a king on his throne. Brooke was perched on the arm of the sofa, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression, and in the corner, looking pale and clutching a glass of scotch far too tightly, was my Uncle Paul. He met my eyes for a fleeting second, a look of deep unease on his face, before quickly looking away. He was the silent, unwilling witness to my execution. They let me stand in the entryway for a full minute, a deliberate power move designed to make me feel like an intruder. Finally, my father spoke, his voice booming through the room. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, not even bothering to get up. "I have to say, I'm surprised you showed your face. Ready to admit your little business failed, and begged to come back to the family." Brooke let out a short, sharp laugh. "Don't be too hard on her, Dad. I'm sure it was a valuable learning experience." "Right, Ava. You learned that you can't survive in the real world without us." They spent the next 10 minutes like that, a tag team of humiliation. They mocked my pathetic life, my small apartment, my hobby of playing business. They painted a picture me as a destitute failure, crawling back to them for scraps. And I just stood there. I remained calm. I didn't engage. I didn't defend myself. I let their words, so full of venom and arrogance, fall into the silence and die. My quiet unnerved them. It wasn't the reaction they were expecting. They wanted tears. They wanted pleading. My composure was throwing them off their script. My mother brought me a glass of water, an act that was more of an insult than a kindness, as if to say I couldn't be trusted with wine. Finally, when there was a lull in their tirade, I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the thick atmosphere of the room. "I'm glad you're all here," I said, looking from my father to my mother to my sister, "because I have some news regarding the house." My father, Harrison, let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a sound of pure, arrogant disbelief. "News? About my house?" He took a theatrical sip of his drink. "What is it, Ava? Did you come to admire what real success looks like? Take a good look. This is what a lifetime of hard work gets you, not playing around with your little fantasies." Brooke chimed in, her voice dripping with scorn. "Oh, this should be good. What is it, Ava? Did you decide you want to be an interior decorator now? Got some ideas for the guest room you were kicked out of?" I let their laughter wash over me. I waited for it to die down, my expression unreadable. I looked directly at my father, my gaze steady. "Actually," I said, my voice perfectly even, devoid of any anger or triumph. It's been sold. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if someone had sucked all the air out of the room. The smirks vanished. My father's face, which had been red with amusement, froze. Then, just as quickly, the denial kicked in. They burst into laughter again, but this time it was different. It was strained, brittle. Brooke wiped a fake tear from her eye. "Oh, Ava," she gasped. "You're completely delusional. You finally lost it. Who sold it? The ghost of Christmas past?" I didn't break eye contact with my father. I did. The laughter stopped dead. My father's face began to turn a dangerous shade of purple. He slammed his glass down on the side table, the sound cracking through the silence. "You have no right," he roared, lurching to his feet. "You have no authority. This house is mine." Just then the doorbell rang. The sound was crisp and clear in the tense room. I turned calmly and walked to the door. Standing on the porch was a polite, professional-looking man in a sharp suit, holding a leather briefcase. He had a neutral, no-nonsense expression. It was Mr. Kent. "Good evening," he said calmly. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm just here for the final walkthrough." I stepped aside, holding the door open. "Mr. Kent, please, come in." I turned back to my stunned family. "Everyone, this is Mr. Kent. He's the realtor who handled the sale." My mother's jaw literally dropped. A small, strangled sound escaped her throat. Brooke turned white as a sheet, the color draining from her face as if a plug had been pulled. She looked completely, utterly speechless. Mr. Kent, the perfect neutral observer, stepped into the living room and placed his briefcase on the coffee table. He was the embodiment of objective, legal truth, and his presence immediately dismantled my father's blustering rage. "Mr. Croft, Mrs. Croft," he said with a polite nod. He opened his briefcase and laid out a file. "I'm here on behalf of my client, the new owner, to finalize the pre-closing inspection." "What is this nonsense?" my father bellowed, though his voice now had a tremor of panic in it. "This man is a fraud! You're a fraud!" Mr. Kent didn't flinch. He simply, calmly, and professionally began to explain. He laid out the facts, one by one, like a surgeon making precise incisions. He explained that the property at 14020 Willow Creek Lane was, and always had been, owned by the Josephine Croft Trust. He explained that my parents were merely stewards, and that according to the trust's bylaws, controlling interest defaulted to the primary beneficiary upon her demonstration of financial independence. He then produced the paperwork confirming that the mortgage note for the property had been legally purchased, in full by a company called SD Properties LLC. My company. And then he laid the final document on the table. A signed, legally binding sales agreement. The house had been sold to a lovely new family, with a closing date set for 30 days from now. My father stared at the papers, his face crumbling. The bully, the tyrant, was gone. In his place was a small, terrified, confused man. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a horror that was slowly dawning into comprehension. He was seeing me, really seeing me. For the first time, not as his failed daughter, but as the architect of his ruin. I delivered the final line, not with anger, but with the quiet finality of a closing statement. "You said I wasn't family. You were right." I paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm the owner, and you have 30 days to vacate my property." In the corner, Uncle Paul just stared at me, his glass of scotch forgotten in his hand. The look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated shock that was slowly melting into something that looked like awe. His silent judgment was my final victory. The next 3 months passed in a quiet flurry of work. The closing on the house went through without a hitch. My parents, or rather Harrison and Beatrice, moved out without another word to me. I heard through the grapevine that they were renting a luxury condo across town, a place half the size of the home they had lost, a bitter pill for a man like my father to swallow. My life didn't become glamorous. I didn't move into a mansion. I stayed in my same, simple studio apartment, but it no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It felt like a home. It was my headquarters, my sanctuary, filled with sunlight and the quiet hum of my own thoughts. On my small kitchen table, there were no deeds to luxury properties or plans for a lavish lifestyle. Instead, there were blueprints. I had used the money from the sale of my grandmother's house, my inheritance, to make a significant down payment on a dilapidated apartment building in a part of town that was often overlooked. Working with Arthur as a partner, I was converting it into safe, clean, affordable housing for families. I was building something. One Saturday morning, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I answered it anyway. "Ava?" a hesitant voice asked. It was my Uncle Paul. "Hi, Uncle Paul," I said, surprised. I just wanted to call," he said, and I could hear the nervousness in his voice. "I wanted to tell you that I finally did it. I told Harrison I wouldn't be renewing my contracts with his company. I'm going out on my own. It'll be a struggle, but it's mine." He paused, and I wanted to apologize for that day, for all the days I stood by and said nothing. I was a coward, and I'm sorry. We talked for a while after that, the first honest, real conversation we'd ever had. It felt like mending something I hadn't even realized was broken. After I hung up, I walked to my window and looked out at the brick wall. The victory hadn't been the look of shock on my family's faces. It wasn't the revenge, as sweet as it had briefly tasted. The real victory was this: the quiet, the freedom, the ability to look at a set of blueprints and know that I was building something good from the rubble of the past. That was Grandma Josephine's real will. That was her true legacy, and I had finally, truly fulfilled. The story shows that true power isn't about inheriting a building, but about building your own foundation, brick by painful brick. It's about realizing that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you were born into. Have you ever had to completely reinvent yourself after a major betrayal? What was the first step you took to reclaim your power? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about overcoming the odds and finding justice. Your support means the world. Thanks for listening.